that, could you speak more about the internal processes by which the parties come up with their candidates? I'm sure it's different in the United States. And also, if you think that needs to change, and it's just my impression that their internal processes kind of incentivize these parties to do come up with consensus candidates. And what do you think about that?
Okay, you're targeting
well, maybe Sahar
or Sahar.
Everyone else.
Okay, why don't we take notes? Let's take two or three questions, and then people can talk. Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name's Joe. I'm with the Security Studies program. I was just wondering what the potential you think there is for a similar type of violence that was seen prior to the legislative elections, whether it's the SCAF initiating some decree that creates protests and then it's violence or something like that again.
With a consensus and violence. Okay, right.
Ibrahim always, former professor at Georgetown. I have a very difficult question.
Okay, they'll all answer.
With all the intricacy of the current problems in Egypt, I just was wondering if I can bring to the attention to the great minds that are here a question is, what would be the directions Egypt would take in the future? And this may be subject of an article that Thomas Kurdisyan can write about, Khalid Al-Jindi or others, but we are all concerned. I represent the past, but I'm still looking forward for the future.
Okay, and then we'll take one last question in the back there, and then we'll get.
Okay. Yeah, we talked, I think, extensively about the internal problems in Egypt, from economic and political and security, standpoints. But as we are, outlining all these candidates, I wonder if it's possible to shed some light on how the international community, perceive those candidates and what kind of effect, those candidates would have in the future to stabilize the region and Egypt and be able to march forward economically and politically, with less issues.
Okay, I think now we've got 3 15-minute speeches, let me just go through the order. Sahar and Sahar and Michele, in responding, I think this gives us a very good basis for thinking about the current complexities in international and what really is the future. Okay, Sahar.
Well,
why don't you stand up for that?
Oh, these are really challenging questions. So I approach this as a formalist, rule of law lawyer, so you'll have to excuse these responses are not as political analyst responses, but I actually care more about the next election than I do this one. Because that's going to determine if Egypt is no longer going to be ruled by an authoritarian and a dictator, whether they're an Islamist or a secularist or military sponsored. I think this election matters in how many people turn out to vote, how many people care, how much discussion and debate there is. I don't know who in their right mind would want this job. I think it's literally set up to fail. And perhaps that's why sometimes I think maybe it's better than someone that's older takes it and they just kind of lay the groundwork for the next person. So that's not, not a crystal ball response, but I think it's the second election. I'm focused on the structure. So another comment or response is, what was really encouraging for me when I went to Egypt in March right after the revolution and in the summer is the shift in people's engagement. People were talking about politics. They felt empowered. They felt they had a say, even if they didn't like the outcome. That is a tremendous change in culture and practice. And that, to me, is much more important than whether the Ikhwan took over the parliament or not, as long as the people will remove them and can remove them if they don't follow through. And it sends a message to the Ikhwan or whoever's ruling that we're watching you and we're going to remove you. Now, is this the question about the role of the West? So I take a bit of a skeptical approach. I accept the premise that the United States plays a significant role in Egyptian politics. I accept that premise, and I realize people may disagree with me. I think that what happened with the NGO prosecutions and the way that, you know, lo and behold, right after McCain went to visit, everyone was allowed to leave the country, shows that we had quite a bit of influence. Now, I take issue with the way that the Egyptian government handled the NGO prosecutions, and I think they were highly politicized. But the point is, the United States plays a role. The United States influences the SCAF, if only because we give them $1.3 billion, if not more. So I think that to the extent that SCAF has any influence over who's going to be the president, they are definitely going to be thinking about whether the United States would approve or not create problems. I think the Muslim Brotherhood thinks the same thing, because Muslim Brotherhood doesn't want to be treated like Hamas. They don't want to be marginalized. They don't want to be designated as a terrorist organization. Not that I think we could get away with that. They're a little bit too powerful now. But they don't want Egypt to suffer because of that, which is why I think they never wanted to put up a presidential candidate in the first place, or at least claim not to. So I do think that I think about that when I think about who's the candidate going to be, to the extent the SCAF has influence, and to the extent the Muslim Brotherhood does. So.
Okay. Sahar?
Sure. Just very briefly, with regard to the internal processes of how parties come up with candidates, well, that's somewhat mysterious. The point that's important to know, however, is that under the current system, parties that have representation in Parliament are allowed to circumvent the 30,000 signatures of the general public or 30 members of Parliament, and they can actually put someone in front of the electorate as a candidate automatically. And we're going to see a number of smaller parties that have absolutely no chance whatsoever. The Popular Socialist Party and the Egyptian National Party put forward candidates that aren't going to do very well. The more interesting question is bigger parties that have, you know, bigger is relative, like the Weft, for example, or the Wasat parties. We've seen some internal debates already as to who they are going to support. Not nominate, but support. So, for example, the Weft had previously said they were going to support Amr Musa. And then, when Mansour Hassan was put forward, they had this debate about, no, well, maybe we should support Mansour Hassan, right? And so on. And in fact, there were some divisions inside the Weft about that. The Wasat party also has had some debates as to which of the Islamist candidates they're going to support. And in fact, recently, in the last week or so, there has been speculation in Egyptian press that they are trying to get one of the Islamist candidates, not Hassan al-Ismail, but either Mohammed Salim al-Awa or Abdul Minim Abu Futuh, to withdraw his candidacy so there can be one moderate or liberal Islamist candidate that they can put their money behind. And that's interesting. We've already seen Mohammed Salim al-Awa say he's not backing down. But I think he actually is the much weaker candidate compared to Abdul Minim Abu Futuh for a number of reasons. He's got no real support base. And then, of course, you know, the speculation of the FJP, the Freedom and Justice Party, if they put forward someone, then that's interesting. The other thing I will say, and I can't answer all the questions, is Professor Oasis' interesting question about the future and so on. Well, I think if we look at two dimensions, I will, you know, with some empirical evidence here, I will crib from the excellent work of the Gallup organization to provide you with some empirical evidence. I think that if we look at economics, for example, and then say Egypt's foreign relations, particularly with the U.S. and Israel, we can make out some general directions, right? I think with the economic policy, we're likely to see something significantly different than what we saw in the previous period. Remember, between 2004 and the revolution, we saw vigorous implementation of neoliberal economic policies, meaning unprecedented number of privatizations, subsidy cuts, deregulation, inviting foreign capital in, and so on. Remember, the revolution, one of the leading slogans was "Al-Aish al-Hurriya al-Adala al-Ijtimaiya," right? So bread, freedom, and social justice. There have been already demands for new minimum wages, as well as a maximum wage on government officials and so on. Demands, there have been, you know, hundreds and hundreds of labor protests. So although we're not likely to see a return to nationalization and so on, we are not definitely going to see the kind of, you know, vigorous ideological pursuit of neoliberal economic policies. Then with regard to Egypt's foreign policy, I think it's also fair to say that the days of the previous U.S.-Egyptian relationship, as well as the relatively good relationship that the Mubarak regime had with Israel, are over. Right? We are going to see a decline or a deterioration, I would say declining influence of the U.S. with regard to Egypt. There's no question about that. Egypt, the U.S. had a relationship with Mr. Mubarak. Right? We know that U.S. policy is not looked upon favorably by the majority of Egyptians. And in fact, and this is where I'm going to crib from the excellent work of Mohammed here in the audience and Gallup, is we look at, which country would you consider to be a political model for Egypt's future? This is a recent Gallup poll. The United States is the lowest compared with Turkey or Saudi Arabia. Only 8% of Egyptians say they want to see the U.S. as a model. And then when the question is asked, do you want, the question is, are closer ties with a country, blank left, a good or bad thing for Egypt? The United States is deteriorating. Only 28% of the people say closer ties are a good thing. 56% say they are a bad thing, and that is a decrease of 13 points since December 2001. Any government that is representative of Egyptians will have to some extent, reflect their views. And that means, it might mean something like no longer natural gas sales to Israel, or renegotiating that, or a different relationship with the United States. Now, the majority of Egyptians don't want to tear up the Camp David peace accords, and they don't want an antagonistic relationship with the United States. But will the relationships be as strong and so on? Will the U.S. have as much influence on Egypt and its regional and foreign policy? I don't think so.
Okay, let's see. I'll try to hit maybe a couple of the questions that were not. So Joe's question about the potential for violence. Typically in the past, it's been parliamentary elections in Egypt that have tended to be more violent, because of local conflicts, with support, a lot of different races, hundreds of different races going on at the same time, and supporters of candidates, and sometimes supporters that had different, clan affiliations or whatever, coming into conflict with each other. So, we really don't know, but I would say, this whole question of if there's controversy, Sahar mentioned this, if there's controversy about the outcome of the presidential election, that could get violent, and I think a runoff will definitely bring the tension up, and especially if at the end of the day you're having a runoff against what seemed to be a military-supported and an Islamist-supported candidate. It could get ugly, so we'll have to see there. And just briefly to Dr. Oasis' question, what will be the direction Egypt will take in the future? I think that Egypt has been for some time and will continue to be for a long time yet in the throes of kind of a struggle among at least three different trends. Kind of what I would call, in a way, the Nasserist trend, the trend of the old regime that and Islamist trend, and a much weaker liberal trend. But it's very weak, but it's stronger than it used to be, I think. And I think that it's just going to play itself out, and it's not going to be resolved, I would say, for years yet.
Okay, well, I'll take about three more questions, because we should probably be out of here by noon. So let's do. We haven't had a lady asking a question.
Given the ambiguity of the variability the Constitution will have and the powers that the President will have, what do you think the odds are that the President will be able to effectively govern? And the other question is, given that Egyptians want a new system, it's very clear that the authoritarian system, very strong presidential system, is not favorable in Egypt. What are the odds that with this series of events, we will be able to change the system? How will the parliament be able to assert itself if you're given a president before you have a constitution?
And let me just do sort of, at the very end there are two, you and then the person behind you.
I have two questions. One of them we'll take a one word. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of transition in Egypt? I think I'd like to have a one, maybe two words. I don't know. But I'd like to get some kind of a feel from you folks, three of you. The other question, we heard about 500 or hundreds of people running for president. There's so much, even the Muslim Brotherhood is divided. I know Samar didn't want to talk about coalition and collaboration. And from my experience, I'm Egyptian American, my experience that it's a very difficult subject for Americans, either in politics or military or even in sport, to collaborate. How this collaboration, any collaboration you can comment on or happening?
Hi, some of you touched on this, the minority participation, especially the Copts. I would ask, especially with the Pope's death just 10 days ago, how do you see, what's the repercussion of that? Because the Pope was very much a unifying force in Egypt for the Copts, and beginning the revolution, he was very supportive of the Mubarak regime, and he went actually and told people, the Christians, not to go to Tahrir because we're supportive of Mubarak. So now, after his death, his replacement is a completely different issue. I don't want to get into that, but what do you see the Copts going after as a unified force and supporting Abdul Fattah as a candidate because of his ideologies, or being divided and going for different parties, give even to Muslim Brotherhood candidates if they were to participate?
Okay, we're talking about a democratic system, but in this room we are authoritarian, and so that there'll be one last question, and each and then you can do quickie summaries.
Thanks. Question about the Muslim Brotherhood youth in particular, and how you see that dynamic formulating with the current party and supporting Fattah. Also, where you see the current party allying itself, if it will continue with the Revolution Continues bloc or move to the Third Way alliance, but particularly who are the emerging young leaders and actors that you're following?
I think this gives us a good agenda for each of you to do a couple-minute quickie wrap-up.
So I think the answer to the presidential versus parliamentary system, which is a big question of whether it's going to change from the status quo or not. So I tend to think, and I have the same analysis in the United States, is those in power seek to keep power and seek to perpetuate their power. So the Muslim Brotherhood just picked 50 of the constitutional, at least 50 of them are theirs, or 60% it seems. So they're probably going to create a constitution that gives more power to the parliament, because at this moment in time that would help them continue to stay in power. So I think that that might be something to watch for, and I don't know if they're going to be thinking about it more from an abstract rule of law perspective, or what's better for the country in the long run. Let's look at this country versus that country. I think politicians think about their own self-interest wherever they are in whatever country. So they're going to say, well, let's have a constitution that keeps us in power. Now, it'll be interesting if the president gets elected. I think the constitutional referendum is going to happen after the elections, because I just think it's physically impossible. I don't know if that's what they want, but so I think the president's already going to be in place. So it'll be very fascinating if the president ends up being someone that the Ikhwan approve of, or perhaps even participated in putting him in place, because then they're going to be in an interesting position where they may not want to take so much power from the president, because he may help them continue to dominate the political system. So, and I don't say that as a critique to the Muslim Brotherhood. That's just my view of power and politics anywhere in the world. As far as the Coptics, I think that's a really interesting question. So one thing I didn't mention in my presentation is there was a discussion about quotas for Copts when they were talking about quotas for women. They decided against it because, one, Pope Shenouda didn't want it, because he was afraid it would create a backlash, sectarian backlash. And as you know, Pope Shenouda had a very close relationship with Mubarak, and it was really a relationship of self-interest, of, he wanted to protect the popes. It was very patronizing and, very Egyptian in many ways. And I've heard, and this is anecdotal, and I'm admittedly not Coptic, that Pope Shenouda also, there was a lot of differences within the Coptic community that kind of got pushed and marginalized under unity as a minority, and that happens in many minority communities everywhere in the little. So what will be interesting is how the Coptic community's natural divisions between the liberals, the progressives, the conservatives, you know, the natural divisions that happen in Egyptian society, how are they going to now play out without Pope Shenouda? Because whoever's going to be the leader now needs to get along at least with the Muslim Brotherhood, or who knows who. I mean, it's so unstable. So I don't know the answer. I think it's fascinating. I do have heard a lot of concern, though, about the Islamists. And I don't know if it's based on fact or fiction, like just fear, but there's definitely a concern of if the Islamists come, the Copts are doomed. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's a concern that I've heard.
Sahar?
Sure. I mean, you know, they're very good and very difficult questions, and because there are three of us here, I'm going to escape from answering the most difficult ones. But I will
we'll leave that for Michele.
I will, you know, respond to this idea of coalitions and collaborations. I think it's an interesting question, and I think that if we actually look at Abdul Menem al-Futuh's base, as well as some of the individuals and groups that are now joining him as a viable presidential candidate, we do see coalitions and collaboration. It is amazing to think that, for example, now he's appointed Rabab al-Mahdi, right, who's a professor at the American University in Cairo, political science, from the revolutionary socialists, right, as one of his political advisors. And he also now has the support of Wa'il Khalil, another revolutionary socialist, and so on. And also, as I mentioned, some segment of the Egyptian liberal population, if we can call it that. In addition, unlike many of the other candidates, Amr Musa and so on, he does represent a concern with social justice issues, right? These issues that have to deal with health for poor people or moderate income people, education, and so on. So I think that we do see potentially a coalition, you know, a wider coalition supporting him than any of the other candidates. And I think just the one-word answer to the optimistic or pessimistic, it's kind of a way out, but kind of pessimistic and confused in the short term, but I think optimistic in the medium and long term.
And Michele, you have our last word.
Okay. Yeah, Ibrahim, I'm sort of the same way. I would say I'm optimistic over 15 years, and I'm pessimistic over the next 5 years. Okay, to make it a little bit more precise about what's going to happen in Egypt. Look, the odds that the new president will be able to govern effectively, you know, it's going to be tough. I mean, it's certainly not going to be the way it has been, you know, in Egypt for a long time, because either, you know, it doesn't seem, there's no consensus candidate, as Sahar said. So at this point, it seems that whoever's elected is either going to not have the support of the military or not have the support of the parliament. So it's going to be, you know, it's not going to be easy. But of course, you know, this person is going to have a popular mandate, you know, and I think that's going to give the person a little bit more of a boost, you know, in terms of being able to get some things done. Regarding the question of Christians and the implications of the death of the Pope, so it seems that it's going to take some months at least for a new pope to be named. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. But I would say that at any rate, we had seen the sort of you know, the sort of discipline or political discipline of the church over the Coptic Christian community had broken down to a large degree anyway, you know, and I mean, you know, if you look back to 2005 or whatever, you know, the Pope was just telling Copts how to vote, you know, and that clearly was no longer possible even within the last year or so. The good news there, of course, is that Coptic Christians have become so much more politically active, and they are becoming active, you know, in a number of different parties and so forth. I mean, the Free Egyptians, al-Masriin al-Ahrar, probably has the most Coptic Christians involved in it, but not by no means only. I mean, I think other leftist liberals, etc., as we all know, there's even a a Christian in a major position in the Freedom and Justice Party and so forth. Although that's a bit of a fig leaf. But at any rate, I would say that I'm not sure that the death of the Pope will make that much of a difference. That this diversity and people putting out their political support to different candidates had already started to happen.
Okay, well, thank you. The three of you, we're very grateful.